Missouri, 1964. The steep slopes of the Ozark Mountains were shrouded in a thick fog the day James Harrington, a United States Forest Service ranger, stepped into an uncharted area. His mission was a routine survey for the expansion of the Mark Twain National Forest, tasked with mapping lands for potential federal acquisition. But this ordinary assignment would accidentally uncover one of the most troubling cases of family isolation and consanguinity the state had ever seen. I was tracing the path of an unmapped stream when I started seeing signs of people. First, a simple fence, then smoke drifting up through the trees, and finally a clearing with structures that weren't listed on any official map, Harrington would later state in his testimony to the Shannon County Department of Social Services, a document that remained under seal for almost 30 years after the event. Without engaging anyone, Harrington left the property and promptly alerted county authorities. His background in biology had allowed him to spot the clear signs of genetic issues among the family members he had glimpsed, patterns he rightly connected to possible consanguinity. This wasn't just a family living off the grid, Harrington explained in a 1990 interview. This was a family that appeared to be breaking down physically because of their genetic isolation. As a government employee, I felt a duty to report it, even while acknowledging their right to live as they wished. What the ranger discovered in that secluded clearing, over 30 kilometers from the nearest town, was beyond anything he could have prepared for. An entire family, later identified as the Olaris, had been living in total separation from the outside world for at least 4 generations. Yet the geographical seclusion wasn't the most alarming part. There were children with obvious deformities, adults who looked almost identical, and they spoke a language I could hardly understand, Harrington continued in his report. When I told them I was a government worker, the eldest man just leveled a shotgun at me and said something like, "No good ever comes from a stranger." The Ozark Mountains, with their rough terrain and dense woods, have always been home to secluded groups, but the Holloway family's situation went far beyond typical rural isolation. Later inquiries would show a closed family system where marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces, and even brothers and sisters had been standard practice for over 70 years. Dr. Robert Fielding, a country doctor who was among the first to examine the family, noted in his personal journal, "In 27 years of practicing medicine in these parts, I have never seen such a high number of genetic abnormalities in one family. The inbreeding here isn't occasional, it's built into their way of life, generation after generation." Looking into county records after the discovery revealed only faint traces of the family. A single birth certificate from 1887 for a Jeremiah Holloway, a few sparse entries in early census data, and then nothing more. It was as if the family had vanished from the records, when in reality, they had just retreated deeper into the mountains and into their own seclusion. Those children never went to a school. Some of the adults barely knew about the world wars or who was president, said social worker Mary Carpenter, who was part of the initial team. But the most unsettling thing was how they viewed their own circumstances as completely normal. To them, our world was the aberration. Local officials soon faced a profound ethical and legal problem. How do you intervene in a family that has lived this way for generations? What would be the impact of breaking them apart? And, perhaps most crucially, how could such an extreme situation have stayed hidden for so long in the middle of the 20th century? The answers started to surface only when researchers pieced together the Holloway history, a saga stretching back to the late 1800s that tells us as much about the Ozarks' isolation as it does about the institutional oversights that let a whole family vanish from society's sight. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Stories like the Holloways rarely come to light with all their original details intact. You won't find this full account anywhere else. The Holloway's story in the heart of the Ozarks officially starts in 1881, when a 22-year-old Jeremiah Holloway bought 120 acres of remote land in what is now Shannon County. Records show he paid very little for the property, seen as worthless due to its harsh landscape and poor access. What the papers don't say is why Jeremiah sought such isolation. Talks with elderly locals after the 1964 discovery suggest he might have been escaping criminal charges in Kentucky. A letter from 1882, found among their things, offers a hint: "No one will find us here. We can live by our own rules, away from those who don't understand our ways." Jeremiah didn't come alone. He brought his young wife Eliza, his sister Constance, and 2 male cousins, Isaiah and Thaddeus. This initial group was key to what would unfold over the coming decades. Jeremiah chose a spot that was isolated even for that time. Tucked in a narrow valley surrounded by high hills, it was only reachable by a rough trail that was unusable in winter. Geographer Dr. Wallace Humphrey, who studied the area in the 1970s, called it a perfect example of intentional isolation, where every natural element acted as a barrier against the outside. Between 1883 and 1890, records from the far-off Pine Grove Baptist Church show Jeremiah occasionally came down for supplies. Pastor Jonathan Miller, who kept a detailed diary, described him as a quiet, suspicious man who never brought his family to church. The last record of a visit is from April 1890. After that, the Holloways severed almost all contact with the outside world. It was around this time that the genetic isolation began. Documents found later revealed that around 1892, Jeremiah formalized a union between his sister Constance and his cousin Isaiah. 2 years after that, his own teenage daughter was given in marriage to his other cousin, Thaddeus. A diary kept by Eliza, Jeremiah's wife, gives a worrying look into their mindset. Jeremiah says pure blood must stay pure, that valley families are weak for mixing with outsiders. I pray for the Lord's guidance, for I fear for our children's future. By 1900, the Holloways had created a self-sufficient community. They grew crops on terraced slopes, raised livestock, and hunted. They built more cabins as the family grew, never leaving the original land. A 1900 census briefly notes about 15 people on the whole property, but the census taker added that he wasn't allowed full access and the family was hostile to government presence. This was likely the last time an official visited until 1964. Historical events reinforced their isolation. The Great Depression devastated the region, and World War II rationing made travel to remote areas even rarer. It was a time when many rural communities were forgotten, explained local historian Timothy Warren. For a family already hiding away, this created the perfect conditions for them to disappear completely from public record. And that's exactly what happened to the Holloways. Over the decades, the family grew larger, more inbred, and more isolated. A strict oral tradition replaced formal education. A belief system mixing religion, superstition, and justifications for inbreeding took hold. They believed the outside world was contaminated, said EMTT Holloway, one of the few who adapted to life outside after 1964. Our elders taught that our blood was special, and mixing it would bring sickness and weakness. When James Harrington stumbled upon them in 1964, he didn't just find an isolated family. He found a society that had evolved on its own for almost 80 years, with profound genetic and social consequences that were just beginning to be understood. When officials finally gained full access to the Holloway property in October 1964, after weeks of difficult negotiations, they were shocked. The family had grown to about 42 people across 3 generations, all descended from the 5 original founders. Dr. Malcolm Harrison, a geneticist from the University of Missouri, wrote in a confidential report, "The level of genetic uniformity in the Hollow family is one of the most extreme cases of prolonged inbreeding in modern medicine. Nearly every member shows some effect of harmful recessive genes." Behind the technical terms was a grim reality. Of the 42 members, 27 had physical or mental disabilities directly linked to inbreeding. Webbed fingers, severe facial deformities, deafness, and intellectual disabilities were common, especially in the younger members, a clear sign of accumulated genetic mutations over generations. Martha Holloway, one of the older women born around 1910, explained the family's structure to investigators. "When a girl has her first bleeding, she is ready for marriage," she said matter-of-factly. "The elders decide who marries who, based on the strong bloodlines. Full brothers and sisters don't marry, but half-siblings do, as the rulebook says." This rulebook, found in the main cabin, was a handwritten manuscript mixing Bible passages, practical rules, and family trees used to plan marriages, a crude attempt to manage the risks of inbreeding. If this story affects you, comment now. Isolated ignorance can be the worst prison. Life on the property was ruled by strict routines. Children worked from a young age. There was no formal school, Knowledge was passed down orally. Some older members could read and write a little, but many of the young were illiterate. Their language was a mix of Old English and their own words. They had terms for medical conditions they recognized, like weak blood for anemia. Their diet, while enough to live on, was lacking, mostly corn, beans, pork, and wild plants. Without medical care, infant and maternal death rates were high. Nearly 60% of the graves in their cemetery were for children under 5. As generations passed, birth complications and early deaths increased, a classic sign of inbreeding depression. Perhaps the most disturbing part was how they saw their deformities not as problems, but as marks of being a true Ozark. A 12-year-old girl, Sarah, was confused when asked about her brother's birth defects. "Why do you ask about Jacob? He's like that because he has strong family blood. The joined fingers mean he's a real Ozark." This acceptance, combined with stories from the patriarch, Obadiah, about the dangers of the outside world, kept them from ever seeking help. When authorities arrived, they found a community frozen in time, self-sufficient in almost every way. "It was like stepping into a time capsule," said Deputy Sheriff William Tanner. But it wasn't just their way of life that was stuck in the past, it was their blood, circulating in the same small group for generations. The discovery presented Missouri with an unprecedented challenge. The level of isolation, the health issues, and the family's social system demanded action, but it raised deep legal and ethical questions. "There was no rulebook for this," said County Prosecutor Richard Donovan. "We were dealing with potential child abuse, medical neglect, and incest, but also with people who had their own rules and didn't even know ours." The first step was medical care. A team of doctors and social workers identified 8 critical cases needing immediate hospitalization, mostly children with severe conditions. Hospitals had to treat rare ailments they'd only read about. Meanwhile, courts faced tough legal calls. The inbreeding was illegal, but there were no marriage records. Many family members had no birth certificates. Judge Howard Brennan took a careful approach, ordering psychological evaluations before pressing charges. This was criticized by some who felt justice was being delayed. The family resisted intervention. 3 teenagers even ran away from state care to return to the property. Psych evaluations showed that adults had cognitive limits from both genetics and lack of education, combined with a belief system that normalized their practices. Figuring out who was responsible and who was a victim was a thin line. Eventually, a middle path was found. Young children were placed in state care, teens went to special programs, severely disabled adults were sent to institutions. Only 5 elders, who had enforced the marriages, were charged. Obadiah Holloway was sentenced to prison, where he died years later, still believing he had only done what was necessary to protect the family. The property itself was a legal mess. In 1967, the state took it over, and it became part of the Mark Twain National Forest. Today, few hikers know they walk past the ruins of one of America's most isolated communities. For the Ozark children entering society, the change was incredibly hard. They faced not just medical issues, but deep cultural shock. Even years later, some had nightmares about being taken. Basic things like TVs and indoor plumbing were frightening at first. The case led to changes. Missouri started a program to check on remote families. The Holloway cohort provided valuable genetic data for science, helping understand recessive diseases. Laws were passed to ensure all children, no matter how remote, received an education. Today, the site has a small, discreet plaque. The cemetery was restored, a quiet reminder of those who lived and died in the valley. For scholars, the case is an extreme example of how isolation and belief can create a separate world. It shows how easily people can fall through the cracks. The legacy of the Ozark case is a reminder that isolation isn't just about distance. It's about ignorance, fear, and being forgotten. As survivor Emma O'Leary Patterson said, "That distance still exists in many places, if we have the courage to look." If you've made it this far, you must have found this story compelling. Leave a comment saying I watched all the way through so I can get to know my dedicated audience. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this with friends who appreciate real, hidden histories. Your support is what allows us to bring these forgotten stories to light.